Imagine the skies over Europe in 1944. You are an Allied pilot on a mission over the Eastern Front, and on the horizon, a shape appears that sends a shiver down your spine. It's a German fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf-109, but not just anyone. On its nose, there is an unmistakable black tulip painted. It's an omen. At the controls is a man who, alone, has brought down 352 enemy aircraft. You heard that right? 352. A number that seems to come from a legend, not a war report. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a phantom. His enemies, who both feared and respected him, called him the Black Devil. To his comrades, however, he was simply Booby the Kid, because of his almost boyish face. But how is it possible that a young pilot, whose career began with a disaster, became the ace of aces, the most successful hunter of World War II? This isn't just a story about a record, it's the story of Erich Hartmann. To understand the man behind the legend, we have to take a step back, to before the world ignited. Erich Alfred Hartmann was born on April 19, 1922, in Weissach, Germany, still a nation reeling from World War I. His father was a doctor who, for a time, moved the family to China to escape the economic crisis. But it was his mother, Elizabeth, who shaped his destiny. Elizabeth was an incredibly modern woman for her time, one of the first female glider pilots in Germany. It was she who introduced young Erich to the clouds, teaching him to read the wind and planting in him the seed of a passion for flight. And that passion quickly became a calling. At just 14, Erich earned his glider pilot's license, showing an instinctive, almost natural talent. At 15, he was already an instructor. When the conflict began in 1939, his path was set. In 1940, he volunteered for the Luftwaffe. His training, however, was an obstacle course. His talent was undeniable, but discipline, that was another story. During a training session, he ignored orders and performed a series of unauthorized aerial maneuvers. A reckless act that earned him a punishment, but at the same time, it showed everyone the total self-confidence that would become his secret weapon. After a long and demanding training period, in October 1942, Hartmann was finally ready for the front. He was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 52, or JG-52, one of the most decorated units of the Luftwaffe, stationed on the challenging Eastern Front. Here, the young second lieutenant, not yet 20, was about to discover that real combat was far more unforgiving than any simulation. He didn't know yet that his journey into history had just begun. Erich Hartmann's arrival at JG-52 was not exactly a triumph. He was surrounded by veterans, men hardened by years of battles, and his youthful appearance immediately earned him the nickname Booby the Kid, a nickname that went from slightly teasing to quickly becoming affectionate. But his comrades' affection couldn't save him from his first disastrous mission. Assigned as a wingman to a very experienced pilot, Edmund Rossmann, Hartmann managed to make every single possible mistake. Caught up in the excitement of combat, he pushed the throttle to the max and overtook his flight leader, breaking the #1 rule of aerial engagement: never abandon your leader. He found himself directly in his own teammates' line of fire. In a panic, he lost sight of everyone, enemies and allies. And to make matters worse, he ran out of fuel, forcing him to make an emergency landing in a field. Mission over. No shots fired, a damaged aircraft, and a terrible lesson to learn. Such a misstep would have ended anyone's career. But in the JG-52, there were pilots who could see beyond the error and recognize talent. Veterans like Walter Krupinski and Alfred Grislowski took Booby under their wing. They taught him not only how to fly, but how to think like a hunter. They passed on the wisdom of the front, patience, risk calculation, and, most importantly, the significance of striking only when you are 100% sure you can succeed. It took time. His first success came only on November 5, 1942. During an attack on a Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik bomber, he followed the lessons to the letter. He approached stealthily and opened fire from close range. The enemy aircraft exploded with such force that the debris hit his Messerschmitt head-on, forcing him to another emergency landing. He had achieved his first success, but he was back on the ground with an aircraft in need of repair. The lesson was clear. It's not enough to take down the enemy. You also have to get home safely. For months, his successes were few and far between. By April 1943, after nearly 100 missions, he had only taken down 7 aircraft. A modest, almost disappointing start. But something was changing. Hartmann was absorbing every lesson, every mistake. He was creating his own personal combat philosophy, a method that would soon transform him from Booby, the kid, into a formidable force. The summer of 1943 was the turning point. The point of no return was the massive Battle of Kursk, a colossal confrontation of armored and air forces. In that crucible, Hartmann's method reached its final form, and the numbers began to climb at an astonishing rate. On July 7th, in a single day, he successfully engaged 7 aircraft. By the end of August, his total had skyrocketed from 50 to almost 100 successes. In September, he passed the 100 mark. What had changed? Hartmann hadn't become a master of aerial acrobatics. In fact, unlike other aces famous for dogfights, he avoided them at all costs. His secret was a tactic as simple as it was effective, which he himself summarized in 4 steps. Sehen, entscheiden, angreifen, abbrechen. See, decide, attack, disengage. First, see. Hartmann was a master of observation. He used the sun, clouds, and altitude to see the enemy before being seen. He studied the opposing formation, looking for the most inexperienced pilot, the one isolated on the edges. By his own estimates, 80% of his opponents never knew he was there. Second, decide. Once he chose his target, there was no impulsiveness. He evaluated his position, that of the other enemies, and planned not only the approach but, most importantly, the escape route. The goal wasn't heroism, but pure efficiency. Third, attack. This was where his effectiveness lay. No long-distance shots. Hartmann preferred an ambush. He swooped down on the target from a blind angle, from above or below, and approached to an incredibly close distance, sometimes less than 50 meters. He waited until the enemy's silhouette filled his entire gun sight, and only then did he fire a short, precise burst, aimed directly at critical points. And finally, the most important step, disengage. Immediately after firing, Hartmann didn't stop to admire the result. He performed a high-speed evasive maneuver and disappeared before his opponent's comrades could understand what had happened. He broke contact, repositioned himself, and began the cycle again. This hit-and-run approach made him a nearly perfect predator. Consider this. In his entire career, he was never successfully engaged by another aircraft's fire. His 14 emergency landings were almost all caused by mechanical failures or by debris from enemy aircraft he had just dispatched from too close. This synergy between man, machine, and a relentless tactic was the key that transformed him into a legend of the Eastern Front. With his method now perfected, Hartmann's streak became unstoppable. In October 1943, he reached 148 successes and received the Knight's Cross. one of Germany's highest honors. But it was only the beginning. In March 44, he surpassed 200 successes, earning the oak leaves to add to his cross. His fame, however, went beyond borders. The Soviet pilots, who were suffering heavy losses at his hands, began to talk about him. They noticed his Bf-109 with the black tulip on the nose, a design Hartmann had adopted to be recognized by his comrades. To the Soviets, that flower became a symbol. It is said that they began calling him Cherny Diavol, the Black Devil. His reputation became so fearsome that the Soviet command placed a 10,000 ruble bounty on his head. Often, less experienced pilots, as soon as they saw his aircraft, would break formation and flee. Paradoxically, this notoriety became a problem. Fewer enemies willing to engage, fewer successes. For a while, Hartmann had his younger pilots use his tulip-marked aircraft while he flew an anonymous fighter to continue his work unhindered. The summer of 1944 was the peak. Briefly transferred to Romania to counter American bombers, he showed that his method worked well even against P-51 Mustangs, considered the best fighters of the conflict. Back east, the run resumed. On August 24, 1944, he crossed the threshold of 300 successes. Such an incredible achievement earned him Germany's highest honor for valor, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, an award given to only 27 men in the entire armed forces. At that point, the High Command ordered him to stay grounded. His value as a propaganda hero had become too great. But Hartmann was not a man for parades. He protested with all his might and was eventually allowed to return to the front. He wanted to be with his men until the end. He continued to fly and succeed, faithful to his code, which included an absolute loyalty to his comrades. His ability to protect his wingmen is legendary, so much so that in over 800 engagements, he almost never lost one to enemy action. The final months of the conflict were a desperate chaos. Soviet air superiority was total, fuel was scarce, and pilots were few and too young. And yet, Hartmann continued to fly. He even refused the offer to switch to the new Me-262 jet fighters. His loyalty was to his squadron, the JG-52. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders. The conflict in Europe is over, but above the skies of Czechoslovakia, there is one last echo of battle. Hartmann takes off for a final reconnaissance and sees a Soviet fighter performing aerial maneuvers over the German lines, almost celebrating. For Hartmann, it's a final challenge. He dives, gets on its tail, and with a single, last, precise burst, he brings it down. It is his 352nd success, the last one for the Luftwaffe in World War II. After landing at the base, he learns of the official surrender. The order for the pilots is to fly west and surrender to the Americans, but the order does not include the ground crew. Hartmann, now a major, refuses to abandon his mechanics and armorers. Together with all that remains of his unit, he destroys the aircraft and surrenders to the American 90th Infantry Division. The hope of fair treatment, however, quickly vanishes. Based on the agreements, the soldiers who had been in combat against the Soviets were to be handed over to them. For Hartmann and his men, a nightmare begins that would last for 10 years. Considered a combatant, Hartmann is sent to labor camps. He undergoes interrogations, psychological pressure, threats. The Soviets try to break him, to convince him to collaborate with the East German Air Force. He refuses, always. This resistance costs him a sentence of 25 years of hard labor. But the same spirit that had made him a legend of the skies allowed him not to be broken. He organized strikes, protested, and never gave in. It was only in 1955, thanks to a political agreement, that the last German prisoners of war were freed. After 10.5 years, Erich Hartmann finally returned home. He found a Germany that was broken and divided. He was a changed man, but not defeated. The story of Erich Hartmann is one of those that leaves you breathless, an incredible mix of skill, tactics, and survival. If stories like this captivate you, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell to not miss the next videos. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments what other historical figure or event you'd like us to tell. Back home, Erich was finally reunited with his wife Ursula, who had waited for him for more than 10 years. And against all odds, his military life was not yet over. He joined the new West German Luftwaffe, becoming the first commander of the prestigious Jagdgeschwader 71 Richthofen. However, his frank character and integrity often put him at odds with his superiors. He strongly opposed the adoption of the F-104 starfighter, which he considered unsafe and dangerous for his pilots. A stance that, tragically, proved to be correct. This stubbornness led to his early retirement in 1970. Away from the military, he worked as a civilian flight instructor, always trying to stay out of the spotlight. Erich Hartmann, the ace of aces, the Black Devil, passed away on September 20th, 1993. In 1997, as part of a broader review of sentences for prisoners of war, the Russian Federation cleared him of all charges, effectively acknowledging the political nature of his long and terrible imprisonment. So, how do we remember Erich Hartmann? On one hand, there's the incredible record of 352 successes, a number that today, in modern combat, is simply unattainable. On the other hand, there's the complex story of a man who fought for a terrible regime, but did so by following his own personal code, focused not on hatred, but on a precise equation of tactics, efficiency, and survival. His is an incredible testament to what a human being can achieve when pushed to the extreme limit. On March 17, 1943, in a quiet, wood-paneled office in Berlin, a German admiral held a report that seemed impossible. It was a single sheet of paper, a summary of raw intelligence, but its contents were more explosive than a 1,000-pound bomb. The report didn't describe a new superweapon or a secret army. It described a factory, an American factory, an ocean away, that was projected to soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men of the German High Command, it was a joke, a piece of American propaganda so absurd it was laughable. But to the spies who risked their lives to gather the information, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence written in numbers. It was the day they knew, with chilling certainty, that the war was lost. This is the story of the devastating truth that was too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe, and how the denial of a single fact sealed the fate of the Third Reich. In the heart of the Nazi war machine, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an oddity. As head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was a man who lived and breathed cold, hard facts. Unlike the fanatics who populated Hitler's inner circle, Canaris was an old-school professional. He was a career naval officer, a patriot from a different era, who saw the world not through the warped lens of ideology, but through the clear glass of strategic reality. His loyalty was to Germany, and his duty was to provide the unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly. His organization, the Abwehr, was a sprawling network of agents and analysts stretching across the globe, the eyes and ears of the German military. In the early years of the war, the Abwehr had been key to Germany's blitzkrieg victories, delivering the intel that let the Wehrmacht outsmart its opponents. But by early 1943, the mood in Berlin was changing. The war wasn't a series of victory parades anymore. The disaster at Stalingrad had been a brutal shock to the system. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was grinding back with terrifying force. In North Africa, American and British forces were squeezing the life out of Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. The tide was beginning to turn. And yet, at the very top, a dangerous sense of invincibility lingered. Hitler, holed up in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, was becoming more detached from the real world, surrounded by yes-men who filtered out bad news and fed his delusions. He believed the German war effort was a matter of sheer will. The German soldier was superior. German science was unbeatable. Victory was destiny. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Admiral Canaris was about to pour a bucket of ice-cold water. He was a man who understood the grim arithmetic of war. He knew modern warfare wasn't just a clash of armies, but a collision of economies, a brutal equation of steel, oil, and aluminum. And from his perch at the center of a global intelligence web, he was starting to see numbers that terrified him. Numbers that suggested Germany wasn't just losing the production war, it was about to be buried by an industrial avalanche it couldn't even imagine. The intelligence didn't arrive in a single flash. It was a slow, creeping dread, built from a dozen different sources. It started as whispers picked up by German agents in neutral countries. A businessman back from the US spoke of a factory so vast it had its own weather. A diplomat in Washington reported on production targets that seemed to have an extra zero. A Swedish engineer sent a coded message about an aircraft assembly line that moved with the speed of car manufacturing. Individually, you could dismiss them. But as the reports flowed into the Abwehr headquarters, Canaris's analysts saw the terrifying pattern. They all told the same story. They all pointed to one place, a massive industrial complex in Michigan called Willow Run. And they all made the same ridiculous claim. The Ford Motor Company was applying automobile mass production techniques to a four-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The goal was to eventually roll one out, not one a day, not one every few hours, one every single hour. To the German mind, this was just impossible. A B-24 Liberator was a beast, an 18-ton behemoth of aluminum and steel, with over 1.5 million individual parts. German factories, the pride of European engineering, took weeks, sometimes months, to produce a comparable heavy bomber like the Heinkel He 177. The idea that the Americans, a nation mocked in Nazi propaganda as a chaotic, racially mixed society, could build such a complex weapon in 60 minutes wasn't just unbelievable, it was insulting. Canaris and his officers did the math. If the Americans could actually pull this off, one bomber an hour meant 24 a day. Over 700 a month, from one factory. At the time, the entire German aircraft industry was struggling to produce a fraction of that number in heavy bombers. The spies confirmed the details. The information was vetted. Even Japanese naval attachés, Germany's own allies, were sending back reports on American production numbers with a tone of sheer dread. The data was solid. But how could this be? How could a workforce of what the Nazis considered inferior people, women, African Americans, immigrants, achieve this? How could a messy democracy mobilize with such terrifying focus? In the Nazi worldview, strength came from racial purity and authoritarian control. America had neither. Therefore, the reports had to be a lie, a massive deception campaign. The alternative was too horrible to consider. It meant the war was no longer a contest of soldiers or generals. It was a war of factories. And if this report from March 1943 was pointing to a real future, it meant Germany had already lost. As one Abwehr officer put it, if these numbers are correct, then Germany has already lost the war. It is no longer a question of willpower. It is a question of mathematics. Half a world away, the impossible was becoming very, very real. On a stretch of farmland in Michigan, a monster had risen. It was the Willow Run bomber plant, the physical embodiment of what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. And there was nothing else like it on Earth. Designed by the industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main building was a single room so vast it was called the most enormous room in the history of man. It stretched for over half a mile. To avoid paying taxes in 2 different counties, the assembly line famously had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn, with partially built bombers rotating on giant turntables, a feature that became known as the tax turn. But the real revolution was the philosophy inside. Henry Ford and his production chief, Charles Sorensen, had made an arrogant promise. They would build airplanes just like they built Model Ts. The old guard aircraft industry scoffed. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," one executive sneered. Ford and Sorensen proved them wrong. They deconstructed the B-24 into manageable sub-assemblies. Each worker was trained for a single repetitive task. One person drilled holes, another riveted a panel over and over. This allowed the plant's apprentice school to churn out thousands of new workers every week. And who were these workers? They were a direct contradiction of Nazi ideology. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly a third were women. The iconic Rosie the Riveters, who operated rivet guns and welding torches. One of these women, Rose Will Monroe, became a real-life inspiration for the Rosie propaganda character. The workforce was a tapestry of America. Over 9% of the workers were African American, and another 3% were classified as disabled, all working side by side. They worked in shifts, 6 days a week. Their collective effort, a relentless 24-hour hum. This was the very mongrel society Hitler loved to mock, and they were about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied belief. The early days were rough, earning the plant the nickname "Will It Run?" But as 1943 rolled on, the machine hit its stride. Raw materials flowed in one end, and out the other, an 18-ton heavy bomber emerged, ready to fly. This wasn't propaganda. It was a new kind of warfare, a war of industrial might, and America was unleashing a weapon the Third Reich had no answer for. While German scientists worked on futuristic rockets, America was perfecting its most devastating weapon of all, the assembly line. Armed with this terrifying truth, Admiral Canaris faced his biggest challenge, penetrating the ideological fortress around Adolf Hitler. It was a wall built of arrogance and willful ignorance, and its chief architect was the second most powerful man in Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring was the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. A flamboyant World War I ace, he saw himself as the ultimate authority on air power. He was also profoundly corrupt and deeply egotistical. More than anyone, Göring was responsible for the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings on Willow Run, Göring's reaction wasn't concern. It was laughter. The reports were dismissed. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he famously sneered. "They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." And that wasn't just a throwaway line. It was a perfect summary of the Nazi worldview. To them, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent consumer society. They were a mongrel race, lacking the discipline and martial spirit of the German people. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce a heavy bomber was, in Göring's mind, simply impossible. he dismissed the reports as clumsy American propaganda. You can imagine how maddening this was for Canaris. He was presenting a mathematical certainty to a man living in a fantasy. He tried to press the issue. His agents had specifics: the mile-long assembly line, the specialized tools, the sheer capital investment. Göring wouldn't hear it. He and his inner circle had their own narrative, an article of faith. To question it wasn't just to question a military assessment, it was heresy. Plus, for Göring to accept Canaris's report would be a devastating admission of failure. It would mean his own intelligence had missed the most critical development of the war, and that his Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies. And so, the report went nowhere. It was buried under Göring's immense ego. The wall of denial stood firm. Canaris was left with a truth that could save Germany, but with no one in power willing to listen. The next step was the final one: to somehow get the information to the one man who mattered, the Führer himself. Presenting facts in the Führer's headquarters was a strange and dangerous business. Whether at the Berghof in the Alps or the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere was oppressive and paranoid. Reality was whatever Adolf Hitler decreed it to be. Military briefings were less about strategy and more about reinforcing whatever the Führer wanted to believe. Into this theater of delusion, the facts from Willow Run were a ticking bomb. Hitler's view of the United States was a bizarre mix of contempt for its culture and grudging respect for its size. He saw it as a mongrel nation, crippled by racial impurity and controlled by Jewish financiers. When confronted with the production figures from the Abwehr, the projections of 1 bomber an hour, over 650 a month from a single plant, Hitler's reaction mirrored Göring's, but with pure venom. This wasn't just strategy. It was a personal insult to his ideology. The numbers were inflated, fantasies, Jewish propaganda. His own armaments minister, Albert Speer, a man who actually understood production, would later admit in Allied interrogations that he knew if the Willow Run numbers were even half accurate, Germany was doomed. But to say that in Hitler's presence in 1943 would have been suicide. So, the Great Confrontation never really happened. It was a collision between fact and dogma, and in the Third Reich, dogma always won. The Admiral's warning was not just ignored, it was seen as a symptom of defeatism. The men who brought the truth were now seen as weak, their patriotism questioned. In Hitler's mind, the war was a test of will and blood, not of logistics. A single piece of paper, representing the dangerous work of dozens of spies, was brushed aside. It contained the most important strategic fact of the war. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing at a rate Germany couldn't hope to match. The decision was made, not by order, but by a stubborn refusal to see. The truth was rejected. The spies were dismissed. The Admiral was silenced. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, the fate of millions was sealed. The consequences of that denial were inevitable. They came first as a distant rumble, then as a terrifying roar that filled the skies over the Reich. Believing their own hype, the German High Command made a series of disastrous mistakes. They continued to funnel resources into Hitler's pet projects, the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, while advanced, were strategically insignificant. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was a revolution, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers. They didn't have time. Because the prophecy of Willow Run was coming true. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became a flood. The U.S. 8th Air Force began its relentless daylight bombing campaign. And at the heart of this campaign were the B-24 Liberators. The planes rolling off the assembly line in Michigan were now blotting out the German sky. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out assault on the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, many from Willow Run, pounded factories across Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its home and was systematically annihilated. German pilots, however brave, were simply overwhelmed. For every German fighter that went down, there was only a trickle of replacements. For every American plane lost, 10 more were crossing the Atlantic. It was a brutal war of attrition, exactly what Canaris had foreseen. The cities Göring had promised would never be bombed were being reduced to rubble. A Luftwaffe general, fed up with Göring's detachment, wrote in his diary, "The Reichsmarschall lives in fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft." The B-24s that rolled out of the most enormous room in the history of man were now deconstructing the Third Reich, piece by piece. They shattered factories, tore up railways, and obliterated oil refineries. The German war machine, starved of fuel, began to grind to a halt. The unstoppable Wehrmacht was being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory its leaders had laughed at. So what happened to the man who tried to sound the alarm? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of telling the truth was steep. As the war turned against Germany, his sober warnings marked him as a man not to be trusted. In Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist sounded a lot like being a traitor. His rivals in the SS saw the Abwehr as a nest of untrustworthy old-world aristocrats who lacked true Nazi fervor. They spied on him, waiting for a mistake. His accurate reports on American industry weren't just dismissed. They were seen as proof that Canaris himself was spreading enemy propaganda. He was trapped. To do his job was to seem disloyal. But Canaris's opposition went deeper. Horrified by SS atrocities, he used the Abwehr to shield members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He secretly worked to keep Spain from joining the Axis, an act of sabotage that cost Hitler dearly. The final blow came after the failed July 20, 1944, plot to assassinate Hitler. The Gestapo investigation uncovered the vast network of opposition, and many trails led to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries were found, revealing the true depth of his opposition to the regime. On April 9, 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the war, the order came from a vengeful Hitler. At Flossenburg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, stripped naked, was slowly strangled to death with piano wire. It was a brutal, humiliating end for the man who had seen the future with perfect clarity. He was murdered by the very regime he had tried to save from its own blindness. He delivered the message, and for his trouble, he was erased. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the final numbers proved just how right Canaris had been. The report that landed on his desk in 1943 wasn't just accurate, it was an understatement. The final tally for Willow Run was staggering. At its absolute peak in 1944, the plant was producing a B-24 Liberator not every hour, but every 63 minutes. By the time the last plane rolled off the line, Ford had built 6,972 complete B-24s at Willow Run and produced another 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Think about that. A single American factory produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed during the whole war. It wasn't even close. Across all its factories, the United States produced over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. In total, from 1940 to 1945, the U.S. manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, in the same period, produced around 94,000 combat aircraft. The American industrialist William S. Knudsen said it best: "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." The German failure to believe this wasn't a failure of spying. German agents did their job. They got the intel. The failure was a failure of acceptance. It was a total cognitive collapse at the highest levels, an inability to process facts that contradicted a fanatical ideology. The Nazi leadership, blinded by their own propaganda, simply couldn't believe the numbers. They were defeated not by a secret weapon, but by simple arithmetic. They were buried by an avalanche of steel and aluminum, forged by the very people they disdained. Men and women of all backgrounds, working together in a free society. The spies were right. The admiral was right. March 17, 1943, was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and nobody in power was willing to listen. Stories like this show that history often turns on moments far from the battlefield, in quiet offices where a single piece of paper can change everything. If you love uncovering the hidden stories that decided history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. It helps us a lot if you like and share these videos with anyone else who loves a good story. In the end, the story of Willow Run isn't just a cool World War II fact. It's a chilling look at how any government, any group, or even any one of us can be blinded by what we want to believe. The Third Reich wasn't defeated for a lack of information. It was defeated because its leaders chose to trust their prejudices over the facts. They built a worldview on the sands of racial mythology. And when the tide of mathematical reality came crashing in, the entire structure was washed away. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant dismissals of Hitler and Göring was a battle for the soul of the German war effort. A battle between evidence and fantasy. Fantasy won, and in doing so, doomed the entire enterprise. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands as a monument to the very things Nazism wanted to destroy: the power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that totalitarianism could never match. The factory floor was a microcosm of the Allied cause, a chaotic, inefficient, beautiful mess of humanity that, when united, achieved the impossible. And so, the legacy of that day in March 1943 echoes through time. It's a stark reminder that the most formidable walls aren't made of brick and mortar, but are the ones we build in our own minds.